At dawn on December 17, 1944, near the Belgian village of Malmedy, the frozen air cracked with the sound of distant artillery. The Ardennes forest, draped in winter's suffocating silence, suddenly convulsed with fire. German armored columns pushed forward, their steel hulls grinding across snow-laden roads, engines straining in the bitter cold. Behind them, prisoners, American soldiers captured in the chaos of the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge, were herded under guard, their faces pale, their breath rising in thin clouds. For those men, expectation was bleak. They knew what German captivity often meant: starvation rations, beatings, and the gnawing chill of disease that spread through barbed wire compounds like another weapon of war. U.S. Army After Action Report, DEC 1944. And yet, on the opposite side of the lines, another story was unfolding. Thousands of miles away from the killing fields of Europe, within the heartland of America, prison compounds were being prepared, not as medieval dungeons, but as facilities that confounded even the hardened Wehrmacht veterans who would one day arrive within their gates. Warm meals, blankets, medical care, even libraries. Such details sound more fitting to a university campus than a wartime camp for captured enemies. To German prisoners, the shock would be absolute. To their guards, it was deliberate policy. America, despite the fury of global war, had chosen to treat its captives not merely as enemies, but as men. This choice would reverberate far beyond the wire fences of those camps. War Department Circular 1, 1943. The contradiction was stark. Across the Atlantic, Allied prisoners in Axis hands were skeletal figures behind rusting wire. At Stalag 8th C in Sagan, Poland, British and American airmen boiled weeds for soup. Had Stalag 7A overcrowding turned barracks into disease pits. The Geneva Convention was ink on paper, often ignored by a regime consumed by its own collapse. For many Germans, hardened by their nation's brutal ideology, captivity was synonymous with suffering. They expected revenge, cruelty, and hunger from their enemies. Instead, upon capture by American units, they were bewildered. Their journey across the ocean revealed a reality no propaganda had prepared them for. Bundesarchive, POW Testimony, 1946. By the winter of 1944, American prison camps were swelling. From Texas to Nebraska, from Mississippi to California, an archipelago of barbed wire compounds rose almost overnight. At their peak, these camps housed over 425,000 Axis prisoners on American soil, Germans, Italians, and a handful of Japanese. Most were captured in North Africa during 1943, swept up after the surrender of Field Marshal Rommel's vaunted Afrika Korps. Others were taken in Normandy, in the hedgerows of France, or in the forests of Belgium. They were transported across the Atlantic in Liberty ships, guarded not only by U.S. soldiers, but also by the sheer immensity of Allied naval power that ensured few enemy submarines could touch them. U.S. Navy Transport Log, 1943. The first moments inside an American camp left an impression stronger than any leaflet or speech. Prisoners recalled steaming food in the mess hall, the faint smell of coffee, the strange abundance of bread and meat. To men accustomed to ersatz rations back home, this was unimaginable. They were stunned to receive medical inspections on arrival. Doctors probed for tuberculosis, issued vaccinations, and tended to wounds that had festered untreated in the field. Even spectacles and dental work were offered. In the words of one German infantryman, recorded years later, "We were enemies of America, yet in that place, I felt more cared for than I ever had in my own army." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. But the treatment was not accidental kindness. It was a strategy rooted in international law, American ideals, and pragmatic calculation. Washington knew that adhering to the Geneva Convention safeguarded its own captured men held in Europe. At the same time, well-fed and healthy German prisoners could be put to work under supervision, laboring in agriculture, factories, and even forestry, filling gaps left by the millions of American men sent overseas. Cotton fields in the South, apple orchards in the Midwest, and timber mills in Oregon all echoed with the sounds of former Wehrmacht soldiers working for the war economy of their enemies. In return, they earned small wages in canteen coupons, enough to buy soap, writing paper, or even cigarettes. War Department Memo, 1944. The psychological impact was immense. For soldiers indoctrinated with tales of American barbarity, the sight of humane treatment cracked illusions. German officers noted the discipline of US guards, the fairness of rations, the curious absence of casual cruelty. "It was as if we had entered another world," recalled one panzer sergeant decades later. The war was still burning, but here behind the wire, a strange peace existed. Bundesarchiv Oral History, 1958. For some, it sowed the first seeds of doubt about the regime they had fought for. For others, it was simply a bewildering reprieve. Yet outside the barbed wire, the war raged on with unrelenting fury. In the Ardennes, snow-choked forests were filled with shattered tanks and frozen corpses. In the Pacific, island by island, US Marines clawed their way across volcanic landscapes under withering fire. Even as prisoners in America sipped hot soup, their countrymen were locked in mortal combat oceans away. This dissonance, the horror of war abroad and the relative calm of captivity at home, underscored a paradox of the Second World War, that sometimes survival depended less on battlefield valor than on the fortune of capture. By mid-1945, as Allied armies broke into the German heartland, streams of new captives arrived, many expecting vengeance. Instead, they too entered compounds where boredom rather than brutality became the greatest enemy. They played soccer, built theaters, staged orchestras, and even published camp newspapers under US supervision. Camp libraries stocked Goethe and Shakespeare side by side. The enemy, so recently locked in deadly combat, was being allowed to live, read, and even create. It was a policy at once deeply pragmatic and profoundly symbolic. Camp Inspection Report, Kansas, 1945. The irony was not lost on the Germans themselves. Letters smuggled back across the Atlantic told families of unexpected decency, of meals unthinkable under rationing in the Reich, of guards who enforced rules but rarely humiliated. "If this is our enemy," one soldier wrote, "then the lies we were told must be greater than we imagined." Captured Correspondence, 1945. But beneath the generosity lay calculation. America knew that every prisoner well treated was a potential witness to the contrast between Nazi tyranny and democratic order. Each camp became an unspoken weapon of propaganda, not through leaflets but through lived experience. The German disbelief was not merely at the food or medical care. It was at the realization that an enemy could choose mercy in the midst of merciless war. And yet, within this quiet contradiction, another story brewed, one far more complex, mechanical, and decisive. Because while German prisoners were stunned by soup kitchens and surgeries, another advantage, hidden in steel and circuitry, was shaping the battlefield itself. An advantage invisible to most prisoners, but devastating to their comrades still in combat. The secret would reveal itself not in the mess halls of Kansas or the orchards of Nebraska, but on the front lines of Europe, where technology, logistics, and innovation tilted the balance of war. And that story, when uncovered, would leave German officers even more astonished than the hot meals and medical care of their captivity. On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted under the thunder of Allied guns. At Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Golden Sword, the Atlantic tide ran red, while smoke clawed skyward from shattered bunkers. German commanders had prepared for invasion, but what they faced defied their doctrine. Across the sand and hedgerows, American infantry coordinated with uncanny precision, as if every platoon knew the enemy's next move before it happened. Orders rippled instantly across the battlefield. Tanks turned in unison, artillery adjusted on a dime, and aircraft arrived at the exact moment ground forces needed cover. To German observers, it seemed impossible. They reported that American forces moved like a single machine, dramatized composite. German officer account, Bundesarchiv. The hidden factor was not supernatural, nor mere luck. It was technology, specifically the quiet revolution of battlefield communication. For the first time in military history, entire divisions carried compact, reliable radios into combat. The US Army had embraced frequency-modulated FM radio, a system resistant to static and interference, giving soldiers a clarity of command their enemies lacked. Signal Corps Evaluation Report, 1943. While German units still relied heavily on wired field telephones and cumbersome amplitude modulation, AM sets prone to noise and jamming, American GIs called in artillery fire, coordinated armor maneuvers, hand-redirected infantry companies in real time. The seeds of this transformation had been planted years before. Engineers at companies like Motorola and Galvin Manufacturing developed portable sets. The SCR-536 handy-talkie, weighing just 5 pounds, and the SCR-300 walkie-talkie, slung on a soldier's back. These marvels transmitted on VHF FM frequencies, with ranges from 1 to 10 miles depending on terrain. The handy-talkie allowed squad leaders to call directly to company HQ, while the SCR-300 could link infantry with tank and artillery support. Designed by engineer Donald L. Hings and refined by U.S. Army Signal Corps specialists, these devices turned scattered units into interconnected networks. Technical Manual TM 11242, 1943. For the Wehrmacht, the effect was devastating. German doctrine emphasized Auftragstactic, mission command giving officers freedom to adapt on the spot. Yet in practice, their communications lagged. Tank platoons carried radios, but most infantry squads relied on runners or field wires vulnerable to shell fire. German reports from Normandy lamented the instantaneous coordination of U.S. firepower, describing situations where an American platoon pinned down at a hedgerow would summon mortars within 2 minutes, or tanks within 10. It was as if the Americans carried artillery in their pockets, one prisoner admitted. Dramatized composite, U.S. Army Interrogation Report, 1944. The technology itself was rugged. The SCR-536 could withstand rain, mud and rough handling. Powered by dry cell batteries, it transmitted on 3.5 to 6.0 MHz. With simple push-to-talk controls, even a nervous GI under fire could use. The SCR-300, weighing 35 pounds with its backpack frame, operated in the 40-48 MHz range, its whip antenna quivering as infantrymen advanced. Its clarity was unmatched. FM modulation eliminated much of the static that plagued AM sets. German signals units attempted to intercept, but FM's line-of-sight nature frustrated their eavesdropping. Bureau of Ships Report, 1944. Factories across America churned them out by the hundreds of thousands. In Chicago, Motorola's assembly lines produced radios night and day, employing teams of women technicians who soldered circuits with meticulous care. At Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, Signal Corps laboratories tested prototypes in sand, mud and snow before approving them for the field. By 1944, the U.S. Army had equipped every infantry regiment with dozens of these radios, ensuring connectivity from foxhole to Corps Command. Army Service Forces Report, 1945. One battle in particular showcased their decisive impact, the breakout from Normandy at St. Lo in July 1944. After weeks of grinding through hedgerows, the U.S. First Army launched Operation Cobra on July 25th. The assault began with a carpet bombing by over 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, followed by the advance of 7 Corps under General J. Lawton Collins. The terrain was dense with bocage, earthen walls that had trapped Allied units for weeks. German defenders from the Panzer-Lehr Division braced for another slow push, but this time American units moved with a speed and coordination that stunned the defenders. Tank commanders, linked directly to infantry squads by SCR-300 radios, blasted through hedgerows at points pre-identified by foot soldiers. Artillery batteries shifted fire almost instantly as spotters relayed corrections. One company of the 30th Infantry Division reported destroying 3 German machine gun nests in under 15 minutes, thanks to precise mortar fire guided by handheld sets. After Action Report, 30th Infantry Division, July 1944. By July 27th, the German lines cracked. Panzer-Lehr, battered and blinded, retreated under relentless pressure. German field reports spoke of overwhelming artillery coordination and mechanized thrusts beyond expectation. Wehrmacht Situation Report, July 1944. In reality, it was not sheer numbers alone, but communication, radios binding men, machines, and firepower into a coherent, adaptive force. The psychological toll was immense. German officers complained that American units seemed to anticipate every move, while their own runners were cut down by artillery before delivering messages. Static-filled AM transmissions collapsed under Allied jamming, while US FM sets continued to hum with clarity. "We fought blind while they fought connected," one captured lieutenant confessed, dramatized composite EPOW debriefing, OG 1944. Nor was the advantage limited to Europe. In the Pacific, where jungles swallowed sound and terrain fragmented units, the handy-talkie proved life-saving. On Guadalcanal, Marine squads used SCR-536s to call in naval gunfire and close air support. At Iwo Jima, platoons carrying SCR-300s coordinated flamethrower teams with Sherman tanks, mounting flamethrower projectors, torching Japanese bunkers in synchronized assaults. U.S. Marine Corps Combat Report 1945. Without radios, these island battles might have dissolved into chaos. With them, the U.S. advanced with brutal efficiency. Enemy disbelief turned to desperation. German engineers attempted to copy FM technology, but the war's industrial constraints left them unable to mass produce. Instead, they fell back on older AM sets like the Tornfew D2, heavy and unreliable in field conditions. "Our radios betray us," one signals officer complained in a late-war diary entry. Bundesarchive 1945. Meanwhile, American convoys rolled forward, their radios crackling with precise, unbroken streams of orders. Yet, as vital as the radios were, their success was not owed to machines alone. It was the men and women behind them, the engineers at Galvin, the technicians at Signal Corps Labs, the line workers in Detroit and Chicago, who made the miracle possible. They designed circuits immune to static, batteries that could endure weeks in the field, and waterproof casings that kept connections alive under rain and fire. Their invisible labor carried as much weight as the bullets fired in combat. Signal Corps Development Memo, 1943. By the end of 1944, German prisoners of war began to hear stories from their comrades about this unseen advantage. Some had fought in Normandy or the Ardennes and had watched American units coordinate with frightening speed. For those later captured and shipped to U.S. camps, it was another shock layered atop the hot meals and medical care. Not only were their captors feeding them better than their own homeland could, but on the battlefield, those same captors wielded tools of war that made resistance seem futile. And in their disbelief, they began to whisper the unthinkable, that perhaps Germany's fate had been sealed not only by tanks and bombers, but by radios, by invisible signals in the air that bound an army into one. The legacy of those radios, and the shock they created in the minds of German prisoners, would extend far beyond the war itself. For while hot meals behind barbed wire demonstrated America's mercy, the crackle of FM across the front lines revealed its mastery. What that mastery meant for the war's outcome, for the soldiers who lived through it, and for the decades that followed, would unfold in the final chapter of this story. By May 1945, the guns in Europe fell silent. The Reich lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies shattered, its ideology bankrupt. For millions of German soldiers taken prisoner, captivity stretched across continents, on Soviet steppes, in British barracks, and in American camps scattered across the Midwest and South. And it was in those American compounds that the shock of the unexpected became most profound. What began as disbelief over hot meals, clean bunks, and medical care deepened into something far greater. The realization that the war had been lost not merely on the battlefield, but in the realm of morale, industry, and humanity itself. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The strategic impact of America's treatment of prisoners was multifaceted. At its core was reciprocity. Washington's adherence to the Geneva Convention was no mere gesture of idealism. It was a calculated attempt to safeguard the lives of American GIs held by the Axis. Reports from Europe filtered home, accounts of men crammed into cattle cars, of starvation in camps like Stalag 7A, of forced marches through snow. By demonstrating to the world, and to Germany itself, that it upheld the rules of war, America placed pressure, however tenuous, on Berlin to reciprocate. For some U.S. prisoners, conditions remained dire. Yet in interrogations after 1945, German officers acknowledged that awareness of America's camp policies occasionally softened local commanders' hands. Post-war interrogation report, 1946. Beyond diplomacy, there was labor. The war machine of the United States required not only factories but also fields. With millions of American men under arms overseas, agriculture faced a severe shortage. German prisoners became the unexpected solution. In Texas, they picked cotton beneath the burning sun. In Iowa, they harvested corn. In Wisconsin, they cut lumber in the deep forests. By 1945, over 400,000 POWs worked in American industries, contributing an estimated 90 million man-days of labor to the U.S. economy. War Department Labor Utilization Report, 1945. To the surprise of many farmers, the prisoners worked diligently, often thankful for the food, shelter, and safety that captivity afforded them. Psychologically, the contrast between Axis and Allied treatment could not have been sharper. German soldiers had been taught that America was decadent, weak, racially fractured, yet in the camps they saw organization, abundance, and even dignity afforded to enemies. Guards enforced rules but rarely humiliated. Meals were not only sufficient but generous compared to wartime rations in the Reich. Medical teams performed surgeries, issued vaccinations, and restored prisoners to health. German disbelief hardened into reluctant respect. "We entered captivity expecting vengeance," one former Wehrmacht officer later admitted, "but instead we were given care that many of our own wounded never received." Bundesarchiv Oral History. Side 57, that shock carried ripple effects. For many prisoners, the experience of humane treatment planted seeds of doubt about Nazi propaganda. Camp libraries exposed them to ideas banned back home. Camp newspapers, often written by the prisoners themselves, debated politics, literature, and the meaning of the war. Some camps even organized lectures by American professors or allowed religious services under chaplain supervision. In this unexpected crucible, thousands of Germans encountered democracy, not as an abstraction but as a lived experience behind barbed wire. Camp Educational Report, Kansas, 1945. But this benevolence was not without limits. The camps were still prisons, fenced and patrolled, escape attempts punished. Interrogations probed prisoners for intelligence, sometimes using the promise of privileges to coax cooperation. Segregation policies attempted to isolate die-hard Nazis from more moderate soldiers. Yet even these measures revealed a deeper truth. America understood that captivity was as much a battlefield of minds as of bodies. Winning the war meant not only defeating Germany's armies, but also reshaping the perceptions of the men who had fought within them. The strategic dividends became clear after the war. When thousands of POWs were repatriated to Germany between 1945 and 1946, they carried stories home, stories that clashed violently with the hardships endured under their own regime. Families starved in bombed-out cities, while their sons spoke of American camps with working hospitals and orchestras. In post-war surveys, many Germans confessed that these accounts challenged their loyalty to the Nazi cause and, in time, influenced their acceptance of democratic institutions in occupied Germany. U.S. Army Civil Affairs Report, 1947. From a military standpoint, the psychological effect extended beyond prisoners. American soldiers themselves witnessed their nation's adherence to humane standards. For many GIs, seeing enemy captives treated with decency reinforced their sense that they fought for a cause larger than survival, that they represented something nobler than the Reich's brutality. Morale, already buoyed by industrial superiority, was strengthened by the conviction that America was living up to its own values, even in the darkest hours. U.S. Army Chaplaincy Memo, 1945. The engineers and technicians who made these policies possible were rarely seen, but their impact was immense. Quartermasters designed ration systems that ensured prisoners received balanced meals. Medical officers established camp hospitals, staffed with U.S. Army nurses and doctors. Civilian contractors built barracks with heating systems, plumbing and kitchens capable of serving thousands daily. Each logistical chain, of wheat from Kansas, of vaccines from pharmaceutical plants, of construction materials from Midwestern factories, was a thread binding the vast American war machine together. Their work meant that when a German prisoner sat down to a hot meal in Nebraska, it was not an accident, but the culmination of planning and production stretching from coast to coast. War Department Supply Report, 1945. The long-term legacy of these choices was profound. In the early years of the Cold War, many former German POWs who had tasted American captivity became natural interlocutors for the new West German state. They remembered the fairness of their treatment, the efficiency of American organization, the strange generosity of a nation at war. Some entered politics, others industry. carrying with them an impression that America was a partner rather than merely a conqueror. Historians would later argue that this experience smoothed the path toward NATO and the integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance. Marshall Plan Review, 1949. For the U.S. military, the lessons were equally lasting. The recognition that communication and logistics could win wars as decisively as firepower shaped doctrine for decades. Radios that bound squads together in Normandy laid the groundwork for network-centric warfare in the Gulf. The humane management of enemy prisoners influenced counterinsurgency policies, where the treatment of captives could sway populations as much as bullets. The Cold War itself, fought as much in ideology as in arms, bore echoes of the strategy tested in those American camps of the 1940s. And yet, beneath the strategy and policy, the human cost remained. Hundreds of thousands of Germans lived years of their youth behind wire, separated from families, uncertain of their futures. American guards carried the burden of maintaining discipline without cruelty, of upholding principles under the strain of boredom and tension. Farmers and civilians across the United States interacted daily with men who only months before had been mortal enemies. These encounters, often mundane, sometimes cordial, occasionally hostile, formed one of the strangest human experiments of the war. Enemies forced into proximity, discovering one another as men rather than monsters. In the end, what German prisoners could not believe was not just the hot meals or the medical care. It was the idea that an enemy might choose restraint when vengeance seemed easier, might uphold law when barbarism was common, might extend humanity in the very heart of total war. That disbelief reshaped perceptions, sowed seeds of reconciliation, and offered a lesson that endures. As one former prisoner reflected decades later, "We expected America to break us. Instead, they fed us, healed us, and let us think. That was their greatest weapon." Dramatized in former POW interview, 1982. And so the story closes not with steel or fire, but with an enduring truth. In modern war, power is not measured only in tanks or guns. It is measured in the ability to preserve humanity amid destruction, to turn even captivity into a battlefield of ideals. In that sense, the barbed wire camps of America were not merely prisons. They were quiet monuments to the principle that mercy, too, can shape the course of history.